This week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our show this week. We're going to take a look this week at the emerging role of the lead director. And we have an excellent guest with us today. And please welcome David Porteous, who's the lead director for Huntington Bank Shares. Dave, welcome.
Well, thanks very much, TK. It's great to be in New York City and here at the Exchange on a beautiful summer afternoon.
Well, we aren't going to let you off easy, though. We've got some questions here because we want to get our arms around this role. And again, you've served in this capacity. So, first thing I want to ask you is because I think this would be helpful to our audience. Talk about your experience as lead director and what you consider to be your critical sort of leadership duties. You know, when you come to the beginning of a day, what do you know that you have to do as far as a lead director goes?
Sure, TK. It's my pleasure. First, let me tell you how much I enjoy your show and how much value that brings to directors across the country. You bring a lot of governance issues and other corporate issues right into each of our homes, and that's terrific, and we're very grateful for it. I'm happy to be here to share some of my experiences as the lead director at Huntington Bank. And certainly I think the lead director position is one, like chairman of the board, that is continually evolving. I think when I think of the qualities of a lead director, I think first and foremost that you have to be a good listener and a good communicator. And that is a good listener and communicator with your fellow board members, the CEO of the organization, the senior leadership, but also the other colleagues or employees of the organization, because that provides you with the opportunity to both learn by listening and help others learn by communicating effectively. I also think that you have to have strong independence. Now that doesn't mean that you're not just a cheerleader for the organization, which you are, but you have to have that independence that allows you to be able to be a good sounding board for the CEO and his or her team and provide that sort of robust discussion that every organization needs. I also think as a lead director, you have to be prepared for the changing role because the world is changing so quickly. The lead director also has to have the ability to do that. Now it may be that a lead director is great during a crisis. It may be not so good during peacetime. And if that's the case, then maybe the lead director needs to change. But I think for many lead directors, if you can provide the stability over a longer period of time, which means you have to adjust to the changing circumstances, you can help to be very, very effective. Then I also think that you have to provide the assessment. And by that I mean you have to be prepared as a lead director to be assessed by not just by your board, but by the organization. And you also have to provide the appropriate and lead the assessment of the board as well as the CEO in a way that isn't just getting your pom-poms out to lead the cheers, but is one that is both thoughtful, analytical, and sometimes critical. And you have to be prepared to receive that. And then last, I think that as a lead director, you have to from time to time be prepared and willing to make the tough calls for the organization. Your fellow directors have elected you for a number of reasons, and one of those is you sometimes have to blow the whistle, put on your striped shirt, and make the tough call. And some of that happens not on a monthly basis or a daily basis or on a quarterly basis. It just happens when it does. And one of the things, TK, I think that can help in that is the importance of executive sessions that board members have and how that's evolved over the years.
It's probably important that we make the distinction that when we say lead director, we're really talking about the pseudo chairman, because if there's a lead director, that means that the CEO is probably holding the title of chairman at that point as well. Now, it could be that there is an inside chair, I guess, in that sense, that could also lead to a lead director. But in most cases, when you're talking lead director, you're talking, you know, the outside, the similarity to the outside chairman.
Certainly. For example, at Huntington Bank, our CEO has the title of CEO and chairman. As a lead director, the fellow board members, the colleagues in the organization, the regulators, our CEO expects me to lead from the position of the lead director. At other institutions, it might be called chairman of the board. I think that what is most important, not so much the title chairman or lead director, it is the responsibilities that you have, whoever's in that position, and then how do you execute those responsibilities.
Okay, so let's dig down a little. You had mentioned executive sessions. We're finding that a lot of people are sort of operating this in different ways. So my question to you is, how often do you do it? Do you do it before the meetings, after the meetings, or both? How do you pass along the information then to the CEO following that?
Well, certainly TK, and I think that's a great example of how governance has changed maybe over the past 10 years. 10 or 15 years ago, executive sessions were almost unheard of in corporate America. Then we began to see them. And then as issues arose, whether it was regulators or governance organizations, talked about the importance of executive sessions. And I think the experience at Huntington Bank may be similar to experiences many companies have. We went from not having executive sessions to then, should we have executive sessions? And then once we decided, in part because regulators encouraged it, because good corporate governance also encouraged it, then we sort of decided, so when do you do it? And our first experience was, well, we do it at the end of the meeting. And that way you go from the executive session right into a report with the CEO. And that seemed to work, except that one of the things that we found out was sometimes there may be important issues that a director may have on his or her mind, that if you had the executive session at the beginning of the meeting, you could have some discussion during the meeting about it. So then we said, all right, let's do the executive session at the beginning of the meeting. It seemed to make a lot of sense, but then once again there was a void at the end. So what we've decided upon, and we think it works very, very well, is we have an executive session at the beginning of the meeting. So if there is anything that is on a director's mind going into the board meeting, they can talk about it, we can deal with it at the meeting. Likewise, at the end of the meeting, we have an executive session. So if something came up during the board meeting that a board member might want to talk about in executive session. And then right after the executive session, I think this is critically important. In my case, as a lead director, but I may have another board member, depending on the issue, we'll sit down with the CEO and thoroughly brief, in this case, Steve Steinauer, our CEO at Huntington, on the executive session. That has worked really well for us. Beginning and immediate feedback to the CEO.
Yeah. So let's talk about how one gets elected as a lead director. And, you know, in the old days, whenever somebody was even going for chair, they looked at, okay, who has the time, who's been here the longest, they had things like that. Well, the role of the chairman or lead director has changed so much. Just real quickly, talk about some of the traits. If you were going to say today what traits, and you touched on some of these with your duties, but is there anything else that you would add if you were listing the traits of what a good lead director should have?
Well, I remember hearing somebody joke that they thought they became the lead director because they missed a particular meeting and everybody said, that's who we're going to make the lead director. That certainly wasn't the case at Huntington. We did not have a outside chairman or lead director prior to 6 years ago, and we implemented it 6 years ago. I was incredibly honored by my fellow board members to be selected for that. I don't know at the time whether I was worthy of that. Some might say today they're not sure if I'm still worthy of it, but I was honored to do it, pleased to do it, and I think as I reflect over the last 6 years in that role, I think there are some things that I think would serve any lead director well. And I mentioned earlier about the ability to listen and be a good communicator. I think that you have to have the ability to develop consensus on the board. I think that's critically important. I think you have to, in many respects, have a variety of skills that you can bring to bear, both as you're working with your fellow board members or working within the organization to both communicate the priorities of the organization and also to communicate the issues both from the board perspective as well as the organizational perspective. And that could be with the colleagues or the employees of the organization, but increasingly it is also important to be able to do that with so many outside stakeholders in the organization. Depending on your industry, you may be heavily regulated. You have to have the ability to deal with the regulators. It may be one where stockholders, shareholders, and large groups of shareholders are important. Your ability to potentially engage them depending on the circumstances. So it is, I think, for any lead director, the skill set that is necessary for your board is one that may depend on the organization. It may depend on the time in the life of that organization. And you look around the board, I don't think it should be the person that's been there the longest. I don't think it's necessarily the person who's the oldest. I don't necessarily think it should be the person who's the youngest or the newest, or the chair of a particular committee. I think if you're going to select a lead director, there should be no arbitrary way of doing it. It should be a thoughtful way that the board looks at it and says, based on this time and the future of the organization, who can best provide the skill set that's necessary on a going forward basis. And that going forward basis, that could be a year, it could be 10 years, it depends.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into something that I wanted to make sure before our time's up here that we have a chance to at least touch on, and you mentioned it, that the necessary skill set, and that's what's happening with all the shareholder engagement and the pressure put on by shareholders to speak to the lead director, the chairman, the head of the audit committee, particularly these days, the head of the comp committee. So companies are still struggling with this, Dave, of how exactly to handle shareholder engagement. So I'm going to put you on the spot. We got about a minute and a half left here, but I want to put you on the spot. Talk to me about how you're approaching that challenge, and whether you guys have wrapped your arms around it yet, or it's still a learning experience for you.
Well, TK, first of all, it's a great question, and you're not putting me on the spot, because just like corporate America, my sort of thoughts and analysis is still evolving too. On the one hand, I'm very concerned that if a director, lead director or otherwise, meets with a certain group of shareholders, then there's a whole other group of shareholders that are left out. So I worry about sort of some having more access than others. I think one of the best ways to deal with it is senior leadership, the CEO and others in the organization, for them to be actively engaged on a regular basis with shareholders in an open, transparent, and robust way, so that your shareholders feel very comfortable with the transparency of the information, with the knowledge and engagement of senior leadership, that should first and foremost be sort of the front door for that. Now, there may be a unique circumstance where it may be important to bring in an audit chair or a comp chair or even a lead director, but I would hope that that's not the rule, that's maybe the exception. And at least at Huntington, what we've found is that Steve Steinauer meets on a very regular basis with our shareholders in a very open and transparent way. And that has worked well for our shareholders because I've talked to them and asked them.
Well, it's going to continue to be a big issue, but with that response and your others, I've always had a great deal of respect on how you run and take care of your business. And so it is an absolute pleasure to have you on the show, and I want to thank you for joining us. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or community member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.